have people asking me like, how are you going to publish this book and what are you going to do with it? I'm like, I'm not thinking about that right now.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Beyond the Manuscript. As always, I am your host, Cooper Anderson, and in case you're wondering why I'm not in my usual mini library, I'm moving. So, for the next few weeks, I will be in this virtual library instead. As a quick reminder, Beyond the Manuscript is currently available everywhere you find podcasts, and if you like what I do here, hit that like, subscribe, and follow all of the buttons. It absolutely helps out the channel and helps me keep doing what I love, which is talk to you lovely people about books. Okay, now let's get into it. This week, for a special Valentine's Day themed episode, we are going to be talking about anything and everything to do with the noble art of poetry. My guest this week is a gothic horror poet and novelist, a poetry editor at the Coffin Bell Journal. Her works include Burials, Bad Omens, and a debuting novel called Hollow Girls coming out on March 15th. Please help me in welcoming my guest, Miss Jessica Drake Thomas. How are we doing today, Jessica?
Good. How are you?
I am excited. Yeah. This is a brand new kind of medium that we're going to be covering today in poetry, an often overlooked aspect of writing. But I figured it is, we're celebrating the Day of Romance. We should talk about the romance language that is poetry for sure. To kind of get things started today, I know it was something as subjective and open to interpretation as poetry. What does poetry mean to you?
Well, I've been writing poetry for almost 3 decades. I started in kindergarten, and for me, poetry is how I check in with myself. Like that's how I really process how I'm feeling that day. It's something that I do regularly. So it's just that moment where I think other people pray, but I write poetry.
I like that. Yeah. For me, and I think what might be a kind of a challenging thing for my experience with poetry is that it seems to be instead of guided a lot of times through like narrative logic, like a story or a novel would be, it seems to be guided either through either like symbolism or just pure emotion a lot of times. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that. I would also go one step further and say that poetry can be narrative as well.
Mm-hmm.
You could totally, when I'm working on a collection, I do have a narrative that I'm working with, and each poem kind of advances that narrative in the same way that, with narrative like books, you would use each sentence in each chapter to advance the narrative. So that's in a way what I'm working with when I'm putting together a book is each poem advances the narrative that I'm working with in some way.
So you have three different poetry collections that are currently published right now. So one, can you tell us a little bit what goes into publishing your own poetry collection, and how does that actually differ from publishing something like a novel or a nonfiction book?
Well, I'm in the process of learning what it's like to put out a novel. Hollow Girls is my first one. But so far it's been exactly the same as publishing a poetry book. Like it's
Mhm.
the publication process is the same.
All right. So, with my very limited training and years in the writing business, I kind of have a good idea into what goes into creating a narrative, right? When you boil it down to its bare bones, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I'm curious as to what goes into writing something a bit more freeform like poetry. Like for you, what is your process in finding the right words?
Well, first I just let myself just free write. I have this whole document where I start and I'm just writing a bunch of poems, whatever comes to mind. Um, then when I'm going back to edit, I kind of look for different themes that are coming up throughout the works that are going into the book. And a lot of times it just comes about naturally. I do start to like color code and like mark which themes I'm seeing. I will point out to myself like what images I'm seeing time and time again, or I'm trying to do in different ways. And then usually I do like three or four main themes and ideas, and I will color code them. And then I kind of braid those ideas together when I'm creating the final manuscript. Um, so, for example, right now I'm working on my dissertation, and this black door keeps coming up.
Mm.
So, yeah, and I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that yet, but that's kind of that image that keeps coming up, and I've got to kind of like figure out exactly what theme I'm going for with this door. And I think I'm kind of working with the idea of like grief and regrets. So yeah,
Very cool. So you
yeah.
mentioned before that a big part of the process is just free form writing and stuff. And I know a lot of writers who they attempt to do that, but that ever uphill battle of self doubt or that imposter syndrome kind of picks up. One, do you ever deal with that? And two, what is it like combating something like that in poetry?
Um, for me, I don't deal much with imposter syndrome anymore. Um, Now that I've published several books, I've kind of got a confidence that I didn't have before I was first published. And the process of publishing my first book was very nerve wracking. Um, I don't think people talk about like how anxiety inducing publishing is. Uh, it really is.
Hmm.
It was bad. Like I would cry on the bathroom floor all the time, just in the months leading up to my book coming out, because
Ooh.
I was like, people are going to read this, like this stuff that was intensely personal, and I think for me, it's the anxiety. What I deal with is the anxiety of people reading something that for me was very personal.
Hmm.
Because even in my novel, like, I feel like that is a very personal book that I wrote, even though it's complete fiction.
Yeah.
Um, it was something that I really sat with at a time when I felt vulnerable and upset during the pandemic. So just that idea that people are going to read this and now they can say whatever they want about it. Um, that's very it's it's very nerve-wracking for me. So that's more of what I struggle with rather than imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
Because like I
Yeah.
feel like I'm doing the thing that I'm meant to be doing. Yeah.
I think you make a very good point there where because I've coached a lot of writers before where they'll get 30% into a book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and they're like, I didn't realize how vulnerable this makes me, and they start wanting to find the exit door really fast on writing the book. And so one thing that you when you're in the kind of trenches of creating kind of anything, not even just a book, but you kind of have to enjoy the process first. You're like, okay, this is what's going to be fun for me right now in the moment. I will worry about everything else later. But right now, as I'm making it, that's what's going to be fun. And so once you
Yeah.
learn that trick, I think everything's going to come a little more naturally afterwards.
Yeah, and I love writing. It is my absolute favorite thing to do. I do it every day. I love it. I get so much joy from writing.
Yeah.
And I have people asking me like, how are you going to publish this book, and what are you going to do with it? I'm like, I'm not thinking about that right now. I'm not. I'm not thinking about
Uh-huh.
that right now. I'm enjoying the process. So,
You
yeah.
bring up a really good point because when you, especially for me, because I come from a very small rural town in North Carolina, and A lot of my friends, when I tell them, it's like, oh, I'm a writer, the first question they're always going to ask, like, oh, how many copies did you sell? Have you made the New York Times bestseller list? It's they tend to um, understand it only in terms of like kind of being commercial, right? And that's not
Yeah.
a wrong way to think about it, really, but it really paints a picture of what we prioritize in an art form, right? How much does this, pay versus, oh, did this make you happy to make? Did you enjoy making the process as opposed to that? So when it comes to something like being creative, people tend to struggle with the idea of like, no, this brings me joy first. This is what I do the most, this is what makes me the most fulfilled. And then I try to turn that into now I don't have to get any other kind of job, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and a lot of times what I hear is like people saying that you have to make good art in order to like do it, but it's like you can just
Yeah,
do art, do writing just because you enjoy it, not because you're going to publish it or because it's good, but you did something that made you happy for whatever amount of time while you were creating it, and that's important.
exactly. And so another thing that in itself is a barrier for a lot of people, where we've
Mm-hmm.
kind of the world's kind of changed a bit, especially in the world of publishing, to where, oh, if I'm not a mega hit on my first book, why did I even bother? Right? Like I'm not a good writer on my very first attempt. Why am I even going to try? I need to be perfect first time, and no one is perfect on their first try of anything. There's
Yeah.
there's levels and there's coaching and there's an education and doing something over and over again for years. And so yeah, it's that becomes kind of a barrier, I think.
Yeah. They definitely like try to do the commodification of art, and it doesn't have to be that way. I get a lot like, "Oh, do you want to be the next Stephen King?" And I'm like, "No, I want to be the only me."
Yeah,
Cuz I've got stuff that only I'm going to be writing, and that's what I'm more interested in. So,
it's interesting you say that, where it's because people, they're trying to put pieces that they know together, even when especially in a business or a world they don't quite understand. So when somebody says, do you want to be the next Stephen King, the thing is you can't be, like, because he's the only one that exists as Stephen King. However, what they don't understand in that equation is that Stephen King also couldn't be the next Jessica Drake Thomas either.
no.
Everyone's got their own style, everyone develops their own voice, and it's a two-way street for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So let's kind of talk a little bit more about poetry itself. So with my very limited education on the art form, I don't know too many poets other than the big names like T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost. Who would you recommend people read if they want to read more poetry but don't know where to start?
Okay. Well, if the person is a child, I recommend this book called Sing a Song of Popcorn. Um, I was introduced to this book in, I believe it was like the first or second grade. And this book taught me that poetry could be fun. It's just like playing with words, and a lot of it is nonsense, but it's delightful. I still have the book. Um, and like I would just reread all the poems. They were fun to read out loud. Um, it just taught me that poetry could be joyful. If the person is an adult, I recommend Cynthia Poleo. Her book Crime Scene won the Bram Stoker Award last year, and it's phenomenal. It's narrative poetry. So each poem um, moves the narrative forward. So they're almost working like little chapters, and you're trying to solve a crime. And it is
Ooh,
the hero's
interesting.
journey. It's
Yeah.
it's got everything. It's well written. It's really compelling. So that's what I would recommend if you're looking to just like dip your toes in. It's really good.
In your mind, uh, what do you think is the biggest misconception about poetry?
That individual person is not ever going to be able to understand it.
Mm.
And I say this, I have so much experience. Being a poet, when you say that you're a poet, the first thing a lot of people say is, "Oh, I don't get poetry."
Yeah.
I have taught both college and high school, and the first thing on my students' mouths at any age level was, "We don't understand poetry. This is too hard."
Mm. Mm.
Um, and that's a total misconception. I think that poetry is not taught in the right way.
Mm.
Um,
What would be the right
because
way?
teaching students how to write poetry before
Mm.
you teach them to read poetry,
Ooh, yeah.
because how can they learn how to read something if they don't know how it was done in the first place? Like, if you don't know how something works, of course you're not going to understand it. Um, but but if you can sit down and listen to a song and understand what is going on in that song, then you absolutely can read poetry and understand it.
Hmm. I
Mm-hmm.
I definitely agree with a very similar sentiment that I've heard from a lot of people who, especially if they haven't read a book since high school, right? They're like, "Oh, I don't like reading," is what I hear all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And the thing is, I know for a fact that isn't true. You just haven't found your genre or the author that you love or
Yep.
etc. But like when it comes to something as big and it's when you say I don't like reading, it's like saying I don't like movies or I don't like music or whatever other genre or any other like medium of art form there is. No, you do like it. You just haven't found the thing you like the most. And you're right. It's not taught
Exactly.
correctly in schools to where, if you're taking a high school English class and the only thing you're exposed to is like, Huckleberry Finn, or something not even from this century, it's
Mm-hmm.
understandable. You're like, oh, this is my only context for books. I don't like books. And it's not true. There's hundreds and hundreds of books out there that you're going to like. You just have to go discover it.
Exactly. Um, I feel like in schools too, we don't yet have that focus on contemporary literature just yet. At least the ones that I taught in. I was handed books that I had to teach, and
Yeah.
a lot of it, the writers were no longer alive by like a long time. They had been
Mm-hmm.
dead a long time, and it's that archaic diction is not. It's not easy to read. Like that takes practice to read.
Mm-hmm.
It really does, and I think that we need to encourage students at all levels to find books by living writers.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to focus on living poets, because living poets are doing a lot of like really vibrant and interesting work right now. Um, and it's so easy to find them too because they're all on social media. They're all posting.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. I had a teacher when I was getting one of my college degrees, and she said that poetry was dead. And
Oh,
she had
what?
this whole depressing class, like talking about like you are getting a degree in poetry. What are you going to do? And it was like, no. And then like literally within the next 5 years, like poetry on social media like took off.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Instagram poets are like a lot of people read their work. Like if you are looking at Instagram poets, you are reading poetry. Like
Yeah,
yeah.
it's true. And it's really funny when somebody says anything really, when it comes to art specifically, is dead. And I'm like, well, it's been around for a few thousand years. I don't think this particular year means it's going to just fall off a cliff and die specifically.
No.
It's going to change. It's going to change shape just like everything
Correct.
else has. I can't remember who said this, but um, there's some author I remember saying that books are like the great white sharks of art. They've never really had to change in the few hundred years they've been around. So yeah, it's they're gonna change forms a little bit, but they're always gonna be here. Same with poetry.
Yeah. And that's comforting. That's
It
lovely.
is. It is a comforting thought
Books are
for sure.
wonderful.
So a metaphor. that I like to use a lot when describing different forms of writing is different forms of fire. And I'll kind of explain what I mean. So for me, a novel is like a giant bonfire that keeps a really wide audience warm. A short story is more like a cooking fire where it doesn't last all that long, but it can give a lot of sustenance when utilized correctly. And for me, poetry is a lot like a spark, where, yeah, it's small, but if it's really dark out, it's the only thing you can see, and if you keep feeding it, the meaning can grow. So, in this realm of thinking, for you, what are the benefits of a society that reads poetry?
I think the benefits of a society that reads poetry are the benefits of a society that reads anything. Um, you know, books have been proven to build empathy. I
Mm,
think poetry asks us to look deeper, because you can't just do, well, you can read through just line by line and look at the surface level and what's there. But what poetry does really well is that it invites you to look deeper. Like, what are the other deeper meanings that are beneath the surface? What else is being said? Something I do a lot in my poetry is I use enjambment, which enjambment is where the line is broken in the middle of a clause, so that then when you read the next sentence, it finishes the sentence, but where I've broken it, sometimes it creates a different meaning for the sentence, where the line has been broken. So then it can be read in two different ways. Um, and I feel like that's a definitive thing for poetry for me, is that it's inviting you in. It's not like, a lot of people feel like they're being kept out of poems when that's not the case. They're being invited in.
mm,
And I feel like a society that reads poetry is a society that looks for the deeper meaning of things, that they're excited to explore and to think and to talk about their feelings. And I feel, for me, poetry does that.
awesome. Yeah, I totally agree with the idea that, especially poetry specifically, because it can be so like emotion driven at times, it really
Oh,
implants empathy into people. And it causes them to be empathetic and learn from different worldviews, different perspectives. It kind of makes people kind of come together. I know I'm paraphrasing like Robin Williams from the Dead Poet Society, but things like engineering and mathematics are really, really important. But things like poetry are these are things that make life worth living. And I know that's a butchering of that quote for sure, but I think it reigns true. I think a lot of times. Cool.
absolutely. I love that
Yeah,
movie.
it's a great one for sure. I think that was actually,
Yeah.
other than like Aladdin, that was like my first Robin Williams movie that I watched where he was
Oh,
actually
that's
like
a
a
good one.
serious actor.
Yeah, that's a good one to start with.
All right, and so my next question is, who are some of your favorite poets that you're reading right now, and why do you like them?
I am currently working on my dissertation. And I am currently, I don't know if this is going to come up. I am reading oh, it's not. It's called The Lament for Art O'Leary. And it is a 300-year-old poem that originally was oral. It's in the Kina tradition, which is a form of lament. And the poem was written by this woman, Eileen Dube Niconel, and her husband was killed, and she was so distraught that he died that she started drinking his blood. And I feel like that's really interesting. It's a poem about love and grief and loss and a whole lot of other things, but like, I've just been reading it and rereading it. It's just really lovely and powerful. Um, so that's been one of my obsessions lately. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I am also reading Emily Bronte's poems. And I'm also reading Anne Sexton's poems. Um, I know I just said that I advocate for people reading living poets. I recently read uh, Stephanie Whitevick's on the subject of blackberries. Um, it's a spin on Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and it is very good. Um, there's also V.C. McCabe's Ophelia that came out
Mm,
recently.
yeah.
It's a very strong book. I read Preston Smith's Joan of Arc poems. It's just Joan and then a colon and arc.
Mm.
That that's a very strong chapbook as well. If you would like some living poets to look into, um, yeah, a
Sure.
lot of
Awesome.
really good books have come out in the past year,
Mhm.
in poetry.
Nice. One of the last things I do want to touch on here, you were mentioning the first book you mentioned that you said you're obsessed with at the moment because you're working on your dissertation with it. When you're reading something, anything really, over and
Mm.
over again, um, one thing that I really enjoy whenever I do something like that, the words in that book always stay the same, right? But
Hmm.
I have changed around it through different stages in my life, different places in my life, that kind of thing. Do you think that is reflected more so in something like poetry?
I do, yeah, just because you can have multiple readings of a poem based on where you're at in life, based on what words you pick up on each read. I feel like every time I come back to a book, I'm different. So my reading of it is completely different. And that's something that's nice about that because you're reading the same words, but you're a different person. You're the one who's changed,
Hmm.
but like the book kind of changes for you, with you,
Mm-hmm.
and
Hmm.
that's lovely. Yeah.
I think so too. Good. All right, Jess, we are wrapping up here today. Where can people find your stuff?
You can find Burials and Bad Omens anywhere that books are sold. You can find my work on my website, jessicadrakethomas.com. And then you will be able to find Hollow Girls, available from Cemetery Dance Publications starting March 15th, anywhere books are sold.
All right, I want to thank my guest, Jessica Drake Thomas, for coming on this episode of Beyond the Manuscript, which, of course, is powered by Manuscripts, where you never write alone. Thanks a lot, Jessica.
Thanks for having me. Happy
Yeah.
Valentine's Day.
And happy Valentine's Day to our viewers at home. Yeah.